In this video, I'll be talking to you about this Space Marine Librarian model, his history, his rules, and of course, I'll be painting him up for your pleasure. I'm Matthew, this is Miniscape. Welcome. You may have seen me painting some Space Marines this year, namely, some yellow fellas, in the yellow scheme of the Imperial Fists. I've been trying to assemble a collection like that seen in the Imperial Fist Supremacy Force, released in 1998. One thing I haven't bothered with is all the fiddly metal shoulder pads and other paraphernalia. I just wanted to use decals, to be honest. Anyway, in the last video, I painted the captain with a power fist. In this video, I will be painting this librarian with force rod. He has a stern face that has doubtless been worn down by the troubles of life, such as rising living costs and congested traffic on the commute to work, when you'd rather be at home painting toy soldiers. Anyway, this lad was released in 1995, around the time of the Ultramarines Codex, and I'll say no more on that until later in the video. I've given him a bolter, because he's an Imperial Fist, and they love bolters. Gives him a better range on his shooting too, when he isn't farting around in the warp. I primed him black, and left the banner backpack off for now since I wanted to get access to his belt skulls. That isn't an innuendo, by the way. The first step was to paint the armour with Calidor Sky. Two thin coats. Librarians tend to have blue armour, regardless of their chapter, because they all want to be Ultramarines, or maybe they want to blend in against the sky. I'll admit, if you've watched me paint Ultramarines, or even Thousand Suns before on this channel, the process here is largely the same. But I don't expect you to have my videos memorised, and therefore I'll review the process again with you. I try to leave some of the black prime showing in some of the recesses, which acts as a shading. As you can see, I'm not terribly neat at this stage, so I'll go in with some black paint later and emphasise some black lines here and there. With the first base coat done, I mix together two paints on my wet palette. The first is Flat Blue by Vallejo, which is ever so slightly lighter than Calidor Sky. The second is Citadel Lothan Blue. The mix is roughly 50-50, and using the flat side of my brush, I carefully apply this to the sharp edges of the armour, for example on the shoulder pads, on all the intricate details of the hands, and on the various parts of the backpack as well, which for such a small piece has many edges to highlight. The next highlight uses the previous shade with some white mixed into it, so the result is a very pale blue. Again, this is painted on the sharp edges, but focusing the area more around the pointy parts, such as the corner of the pauldrons, the upper facing part of the fingers, and again, some of the edges on the backpack too. I'm only showing you samples of what I highlighted here, but much of this work I did off camera. I'm sure you don't need to see every brush stroke after all. The final part for the blue armour is to make it really pop, with a dot of white on all the extreme corners. And that's to draw attention to those areas and emphasise the geometry of the model. At least that's what I think anyway. I mean, what do I know, to be honest? While the backpack is to hand, I decided to paint the pipes and the vents and such with Warpaint's Fanatic Wolf Grey. I put some on my wet palette, load my brush, and then wipe much of it off. I drag the brush across the ridges of the vents and the pipes, just to catch most of the details. Some of this part of the model remains black, and that's fine. That can be our shade. I mix some white into the wolf grey on my palette, and repeat this process with the lighter colour covering less area. There. That looks nice. The bolt gun was already black from priming, I used Warpaint's Fanatic Wolf Grey to highlight the edges with my 00 brush, and like I did with the backpack, I mixed in a little white next for the second highlight for the sharper edges. The reference picture I was using showed some of the model was yellow. Since most yellow paints need a much lighter base coat, I decided to paint a number of areas on the Librarian with dark sand, namely the trims on his leg armour, his left pauldron, his chest, and his loincloth. That was going to take a couple of coats to do, so while the first coat was drying, I got out some corn red and painted this on the exposed pipes and all over the shaft of his force rod. That was the base coat, but I wanted to lighten that somewhat, so the next layer was achieved using Vallejo Dark Vermilion. The rod has this filigree pattern, so in the spaces between this pattern was where I painted the lighter shade of red. Now this Librarian miniature has an intricate series of pipes and tubes on the inside of his force hood. I wasn't sure what to do with these at this stage, so I painted them all corn red, and outsourced any other problems for future Matthew. The next colour was Vallejo Flat Brown, which I painted on the book and on the skull, on the top of his rod and his pistol holster, as well as the Imperialis symbol on the top of his force hood. I mixed some Vallejo Orange Red with Dark Vermilion and painted this on some of the prominent red parts of the rod. Then with the minimum amount of paint on my brush, I swept this across the ridges on the pipes to highlight the raised portions. Finally, I repeated this process using a mixture of dark sand and Vallejo Orange Red. With the red part of the rod done, I used my 00 size brush to paint dark sand over all the filigree, since again, this was going to be a base coat before I applied some yellow later. I diluted some Vallejo Orange Red with water and painted this onto the lower part of the pauldron. This resulted in some tide marks, so I wet blended some dark sand around the mid portion of the pauldron, and it left me with this gradient here. This kind of thing was also done on the loincloth and the leg armour trims. This was one of those occasions where an innocent mistake led to a rather satisfying step. The next colour of choice was Vallejo Tan Earth, which I used to base coat all the areas which had skulls and purity seals and book pages. For the book pages, I made sure that there was hardly any paint on the brush, so that very little of it slipped into the recesses. I used some dark sand to bring back the highlights on the loincloth, and covered up some of the excess orange. Scrag Brown, actually no, it was Vermin Brown, which is an ancient paint which I've had for many years. This was used to paint the Imperialis symbol on top of the force hood, and the symbol on top of the banner pole. You'll see where this is going, bear with me. It's time for that Liquid Talent Citadel Imperial Fists contrast paint. This is what all that mucking about with dark sand and orange reds has been about. I paint this on the pauldron, making sure my brush strokes mostly end at the top. The intention here being to sustain the gradient which I've begun by having more orange at the bottom and more yellow at the top. Then this yellow goes on all the areas which I've painted dark sand, such as the cloth and the armour trims and the filigree on the rod. Space Marine Librarians, namely the model I have here and his contemporaries, were released by Games Workshop in 1995. The first round of releases came in April of that year, along with the Ultramarines Codex release wave. Here's some of the pricings for the issue, showing the Codex at a humble £9.99, and each Librarian model at £2.99, which came in a blister pack. Interestingly, the same price as a Space Marine Apothecary, Veteran Sergeant, or Terminator with Lightning Claws, also released that month. The Librarian models released that month were featured on the Heavy Metal page in the magazine, 2 with Force axes, 1 with a Force sword, and 1 with a Force rod. At the top of this page were some banners printed to scale, So if you had no regard for being a collector 30 years later, you could totally chop up the pages of your magazine and stick them to your model. And if you didn't get that White Dwarf issue, you could have done the same with your codex. That is, if you really hate everything that is good and right in this world. One bit of trivia I've noticed from this magazine was this advert for a new store opening in the city of Carlisle in the north of England. This used to be my local games workshop in my childhood, and the place where I would spend many weekends as a youth. It's interesting to read about the offers on the day when this store opened. Buy 2 blister packs, get a third free. And in some cases, bundle deals with 33% savings. What a time to be alive. The model I have been painting was released the following month, along with another sculpt with the Force Sword. You'll notice librarians are referred to by their ranks: Epistolary, Codicia, and Lexicanum. And if I've butchered the pronunciation of those words, then worry not. I mean, come on, you knew what I meant. Interestingly, certain sculpts are labelled with these ranks. Does that mean that such models could only be used as the ranks indicated? I don't think so. But if one wanted to be incredibly fastidious, one would observe the markings on their tabards, as you can see from this image here. These beautiful models were designed by the legend Jez Goodwin, and came with a plastic character arm sprue and plastic character backpack sprue, 102533 and 102532 respectively. Write that down. Codex Ultramarine states that librarians are powerful psychers, trained to use their powers in battle to unleash energy blasts, to sense the enemy's movements, and to predict the fortunes of battle. They learn how to read the Emperor's tarot, and to sense demons and other such creatures through the warp. I never put demon movements down as being subtle, but there we go. Makes them creepier, I suppose. In 2nd edition 40k, it really was a good idea to have a psyker in your army. Failure to include one rendered you less effective at nullifying enemy psychic powers, and denied you the ability to cast your own. Librarians were a character choice for Space Marine armies, and came in 4 flavours, indicating their rank and experience. A Lexicanum cost 53 points, the Codicia 97, and Epistolary 152. Finally, the Chief Librarian cost 196 points. With each increment, the psychic level of the psyker increased, as did their wargear card allowance, and of course their basic stats. Interestingly, the Chief Librarian was the only vanilla character to have 4 wounds, putting him on a par with Tigurius and Big Daddy Calgar. Librarians had access to some unique wargear cards, such as Force Weapons and Psychic Hoods. Force Weapons allowed the Psyker to store warp cards from one turn to the next, since usually these had to be discarded at the end of the Psychic phase. A Force Axe or Sword could store 1 such card, while Force Rods could store 3. Each Force Weapon increased the wielder's strength characteristic by a number equal to the Psyker's mastery level. The Axe or Sword allowed a warp card to be expended to gain additional strength bonuses, and the ability to reduce the opponent's armor save. These weapons certainly came into their own against demons which were automatically wounded, with no saving throw possible. The Psychic Hood allows a player to re-roll dice when he attempts to nullify psychic powers. Librarians were able to choose their psychic powers from the Librarian, Inquisition, and Adeptus decks. Each deck contained 8 powers, with varying effects and force costs. I'm not going to go through each card now. At some point, I'll do a deep dive video for the Dark Millennium expansion. But in the Librarian deck, there's some familiar names, such as Smite, Quickening, Psychic Shield, and Iron Arm, which have made appearances in other editions of 40k. The Adeptus deck has gems such as the Gate, which creates 2 portals on the battlefield to allow models to teleport across a distance of up to 18 inches. And I can't forget the power Lightning Arc, which an opponent once used against my Orc forces, which sizzled an entire squad of boys before it came to an end. I fancied doing some face work next. I'm going to use a pale skin recipe I have tried many times, and I like it because of the contrast it delivers. It starts with a base coat of Screamer Pink by Citadel. Next, I mix some of that with Army Painter Barbarian Flesh to get a mid-tone, which goes everywhere but the deepest recesses. Bear in mind, you don't have to use the exact paints I do. Similar shades will achieve similar results. The next shade is Neat Barbarian Flesh, which is the majority colour you will see once this job is finished. But I leave the lower parts alone, letting the previous colours do the shading. If you do this right, there's no need for any washes. Finally, I mix some Barbarian Flesh with white and use this to highlight prominent areas such as the eyebrows and the tops of the forehead, on the nose and on the sharp cheekbones. For the eyes, I do something a bit different. I paint them white first, followed by a very pale blue in the middle parts. No pupils. Let's just say our man's eyes are glowing as he is deep in a warp trance. And that's the face done. Off camera, I used Wolf Grey to paint the part of the Force hood that touches the head, and highlighted the edges with Fenrisian Grey by Citadel. Back to the Imperialis, and I paint the edges of the skull and the raised part of each feather with Avalanche Sunset. Sticking with yellow, I crack out the Flash Kits yellow, and paint this on the raised areas of the loincloth, on the armour trims, on the pauldron, and on the filigree on the rod. I use dark sand followed by a mix of dark sand and white to highlight all the skull symbols and purity seals, and anything else of this shade. I want the book and all the brown leather areas to have cracked corners, to show that the leather has been worn. So I use Scrag Brown and paint some thin lines with my 00 brush on the edges of the book and the pistol holder. I then repeat this with a mix of Scrag Brown and dark sand, painting another layer of thin lines. I do this on the necklace as well, which holds another book around his neck, which is a fantastic look, by the way. Who doesn't want to have a book around their neck? One last thing to do on the Imperialis, and that's to paint the corners with dark sand just to really make it pop. There's a few components that need some grey paint, so I mix some Wolf Grey with black on my wet palette and paint this on the clasps of his book, which I later highlight with Fenrisian Grey. There's only a few details left to do. Off camera, I painted some of the cables in his Force hood Flash Kits yellow. I haven't used any green paint yet. I paint some Caliban green on the wax seal and on the power cable at the top of the hood. I round off that process by highlighting the cable and the purity seal with Warpstone Glow, which I also applied to all the things that look like blinking lights. I'd almost forgotten about the under armour. Painting this as a youth filled me with trepidation, since I always felt I was going to make a big mistake with it. Has anyone else ever had that feeling? Let me know in the comments. I braved the challenge of blacklining the armour for emphasis, using some thin black paint and a thin brush. Here's a few examples of that. It was time for the banner, which I printed on white paper. And here you can see me carefully painting the banner incorrectly, which I had to fix later. The blue goes in the middle section, not the edges, you fool. I painted the skull and book with tan earth, and the book cover with flat brown. I covered the erroneous blue with dark sand, and then painted it with Avalanche Sunset afterwards. While that dried, I painted the pauldron with some gloss varnish to better take the decal. On the banner, I painted some dark sand over some of the tan earth areas to, well, highlight it, I guess. The book cover got a highlight too. A final highlight was done with a white and a dark sand mix. And then the yellow was redone with Flash Kits yellow. While that dried, I painted the base with Army Painter Goblin green, top and rim, which required a few thin coats. On the banner, I used this fine liner pen to draw on the black outline and shade in the fist better. and also write on some wavy lines or other nonsense incantation onto the book. I stuck the banner to another piece of paper using PVA. I had pre-painted this piece of paper with yellow. And here's the banner nicely trimmed, just before I glued it to the banner with Mod Podge. Yeah, it's not even or centre, but the 3-foot rule applies. The pauldron got a decal which was finished with micro sol and another coat of gloss varnish, then matte varnish the following day. I glued the back banner to our chap using superglue, and there we have it. One Librarian epistolary model, ready to give psychic support to my fledgling Imperial Fists collection. I say epistolary, but you'll notice I haven't painted a band on the tabard to confirm that. This is intentional. Let's say I'm sitting on the fence, and this was a freehand I simply couldn't be bothered to do at this stage. Anyway, I'm pleased with the result, and would you believe this is only the second Librarian I have painted for this edition of the game, the other being Tigurius for my Ultramarines. I have no lack of other Librarian models, but they are for my other less important collections. So that leaves the Imperial Fists lacking one thing from the Supremacy Force: a chaplain, and he will be coming soon. In fact, I have already started painting him at the time of this recording, so keep an eye on the channel. He surely won't be long. And a reminder, if you like what I do, please do check out my Instagram. And with that, I had better go paint some more minis. Take care, and thanks for watching. What's he thinking in there? What's he thinking in that mind of his? I'm talking about one Tim Librarian. Quite the pragmatic contrarian. He's fine even when not concealed, for he has that power, psychic shield. He's smug knowing what the future will be. Presence gives him that advantage, you see. But what's he thinking in there? What's he thinking in that mind of his? And watch out for that old chestnut smite. Even armored soldiers he can set alight. But now the melee is thickening. He's building up for a deadly quickening, and greater demons can ill afford to take a blow from his force sword. But should he fall into a sticky situation, he can always escape via teleportation. What's he thinking in there? What's he thinking in that mind of his? What's he thinking in there?